I'm so glad that you guys are here. This is an Interact Salon, a very special one. Super salon with host Nathan Baschez and our special guest Eugene Wei. Special because of the participants, special because it's recorded, and special because this was our first super salon where the tickets were free. Christmas time, this is our gift. And I really appreciate everybody showing up. I know that you're busy wrapping presents. So let's dive into status as a service or disservice.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for kicking us off. So I'll play the role of kind of like questioner slash moderator. Eugene will play the role of expert that I'll get to ask a lot of questions from. And I guess in the chat, like in probably the first part, I'll just like ask a bunch of questions, but I want this to be really interactive. So if anybody has questions, throw them in the chat, raise your hand. We can kind of get a good discussion going. So I'm really excited about it. Maybe the best place to start is kind of like, Eugene, could you tell us about status as a service? Obviously, like maybe just like brief recap of what that post was, but also kind of like the context of like what was going on when you were writing it. What were you thinking about and what was going on in the world at that time? I think it'd be a great place to start.
Yeah, so I wrote that in 2019. Is that right? Yeah, February of 2019. Gosh, it's been so long. I don't actually remember what was the exact context that sort of spurred me to write it, but I do think a couple things were going through my head. One was that I was just really fascinated by social because social apps were probably the fastest growing tech companies or networks that I'd ever seen probably in human history. And that's always noteworthy. And I was curious why some of the theories around networks didn't really feel satisfactory to me, to explain why certain networks worked, certain networks didn't. Especially why, if you believed in Metcalfe's law, why the biggest networks just didn't run away from all the other networks. And so
can we recap Metcalfe's law really quickly?
Oh yeah, that's just like a law that says kind of like the usefulness of a network sort of scales exponentially with I think that's what it's like with the number of people, number of nodes on the network. It's
basically like bigger is better, and that's all there is to it. It's kind of like what the law says, right?
And then I think just as a user of social media and seeing people around me use social media, it's always just kind of a fascinating petri dish of human nature that always kind of fascinated me. The other thing was that crypto was sort of just starting to become a big thing at the time. And I found at a systems level, crypto to be kind of interesting. It was an interesting framework. And at some point, I think it just clicked in my head that there was some parallel between some of the ideas of crypto and how that worked and why certain social networks were starting to take off. In particular, I was sort of writing my theory around the rise of Western social media. And so anyhow, my basic thesis around social networks was that one, this is not anything to do with social, but just human nature is that we are driven to seek out status and that we are driven to seek it out in the most efficient way possible. So those were kind of the two tenets. And then my sort of crypto metaphor was that I thought that this idea of proof of work, that there was some version of that seemed to work in social media, that each, whether it was Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, or, you can go down the list, there always seemed to be some sort of proof of work built into the system structurally that sort of act as like a status filter and as a mechanism for growth. So, going back to my original question, I was like, well, why do some networks work so well and just take off and achieve hypergrowth? And why do others not? Now, it's important to note that I don't think status is the only way that social networks can grow. There are clearly a lot of networks that don't use status mechanisms. But one thing in Western social media that we chose in particular was this architecture of a feed. In many ways, I think we still haven't grappled enough with the fact that that was the dominant sort of architectural pattern of all Western social media. And it's driven partially by the mobile phone as the primary interface, you know, being a very small screen size. It's also partially driven by the fact that most of Western social media is monetized by advertising. So you have a bunch of structural choices that a lot of these companies made. And eventually, if you have a feed and that's your dominant architecture and you need to keep people scrolling the feed, you get a problem as you start to scale up, which is signal to noise. You follow a lot of people on social networks. I think it's really underrated the extent to which many social networks fail because they can't maintain high enough signal to noise. You know, you take even networks that aren't entirely purely status driven, like if you take an entertainment network like a TikTok, but even, you know, any social network you use that has a feed, you know that as you start to follow more people, you just have a lot of low quality content come through. So because of this, most Western social media companies started to put in algorithms to try to govern this problem. In the beginning, when you first launch a social network, the problem is just not enough content and people don't come back because no one's posted anything new because no one's using it. Later on, if you're lucky enough to achieve scale, the problem is there's just like too much junk. And if people get bored, they may not open the app enough. So at some point, almost all Western social media switched to some sort of algorithm. And then you have a problem of, well, if you're going to put an algorithm in to pick and choose what is like ranked higher, what people see, you have to choose a criteria. Like, what is that evaluation going to be based on? And if you're an ad-driven company, ideally, you want some criterion that will select for the peak number of, you know, scrolls and stories seen, because your ad inventory has to be jammed in between all this stuff. So engagement, broadly speaking, became the dominant sort of algorithmic selection criterion. And anytime you have an algorithm like that, you essentially are saying that distribution of content on that network is going to be governed by that algorithm. And, you know, one reason we post on social media is because we want people to see it. So essentially, ever since then, we've all been in this sort of zero-sum game of competing against algorithms to get distribution. And, you know, engagement then ends up being our proxy for status on these networks, because if you're posting things and no one sees it, there's not really any point. But also reflexively, the stuff we see on social media is sort of a proxy for status for other people. Like if other people's content keeps being shown in our algorithm, it ends up being kind of like, you know, distribution and status are sort of intertwined. And I think, you know, that's kind of like a rough summary of all of this, but I think those things are all connected. And if there was, you know, if I were to rewrite my piece today, I would probably talk a little bit more about why those architectural decisions led to this sort of zero-sum status competition that we're all engaged in. But later, if we want to talk about like some of the issues that has led to, I think it also goes back to these architectural choices.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think to me, I remember when the post came out, I was working at Substack at the time, and it was both exciting but also potentially concerning to us. Exciting because, you know, obviously writing to some extent is about gaining status, right? Like you want to publish thoughts and be smart and have people sort of acknowledge your expertise in a field as one of the goals that people have when they write. So it felt like there was some way that we could plug it in, but also it's challenging because a lot of the stuff you're talking about with algorithms, I mean, we're living in an email world, right? Where email is kind of like the last frontier of feeds that are sort of like not really algorithmically sorted. I mean, Gmail does its best to like sort out things into newsletters or promotions and otherwise, but it's not the same experience as the one that's provided by Twitter or Facebook or other places where people find content, I guess. So, I wasn't around when they made the decision to build the app, but from day one, we talked about building an app. From day one, we also talked about not wanting to recreate some of the same problems that these sort of algorithms create. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like how those things can be balanced, potentially getting the signal to noise ratio to the kind of competitive frontier that can actually attract attention versus all the other places people can spend their attention. And, allowing people to not walk away from the experience feeling a little bit like, kind of icky or like it was a little bit, maybe a waste of time.
Yeah. It's interesting when I meet someone new and they talk about the piece. I'm always curious what a person's, if they have like a negative or positive valence towards the word status. There are times that people use it very pejoratively, and it's like, oh, like, status seeking seems like a negative thing.
Yeah.
Which, I would say more people lean that way in the West, at least that I've encountered. But, part of my, original post was just like, you can't take that out of human nature. Humans seek status. It's just like we're hardwired for this. But I think it doesn't have to be always negative. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions from my posts is I have a lot of founders who would come to me and they're like, I'm trying to build some network and I want to put some status mechanisms into it. To me, how you choose to allocate status in whatever product or service you design should attach to the values that you want your network or service to have. You're just designating what is seen as high status, and that's totally in your control. Everything that you design, everything that's on the screen, how distribution is governed, how attention is managed in your network is going to be tied to your, is going to ultimately designate like what is seen as high status. So if you can attach that to your values, I think a status can be a really good thing. We give out Nobel Prizes and Pulitzer Prizes and things like that because we want to encourage certain types of human striving and achievement. But again, if you're doing an ad-based network and you're going to leave it to an engagement-based algorithm, it gets tricky. It can sort of get out of your control. The weird thing about social media is that it's kind of like this cybernetic system where we are all sort of complicit in, like what tweets or Instagram posts that we like ends up being the input data to the algorithm that determines more of what we see. And so this is like this like trap where you feel like you're stuck inside that system. So that's, I think the first thing is like when you're designing these things is to think about, hey, what if you're doing a Substack, you may want to say, look, we want to encourage great writing and, in different categories. How do we select for that and not select just for raw engagement? One of the problems I think of Western social media that's sort of manifested itself in this sort of, I don't know, call this like late stage first era of social media is that most of the social media apps can only really capture positive signal like through likes and, retweets or, mechanism like that. Most of them don't have any sort of negative feedback collection mechanism that's really clean. One of the reasons that TikTok works pretty well for what it does is that it's designed to capture negative feedback. But apps like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, where there are multiple posts on the screen, you can't even really tell what someone's looking at. You don't know if they scrolled past because they didn't like something or whatnot. And so, in cybernetics, if you have a system that only captures positive feedback, but not negative feedback, you're going to overfit. You're going to overfit on highly engaging posts that may be annoying a lot of people. I see this a lot with Twitter. Honestly, Twitter, Instagram, everything, they've been around so long that you can see them as evolutionary systems where the natural selection or the selection algorithm has kind of settled at some equilibrium. Like, I think we're at a local maximum for all these things. You know, in Twitter, you see a lot of these like tweet storms and these things like, you know, hey, I read this, you know, thing, and here's a summary of the best thoughts from, I don't know, like Richard Branson or whatnot, you know, because people kind of know that that stuff works. It's a hack for getting attention. And because social media is kind of reflexive, we can all see other people's posts that are achieving virality. People tend to imitate very quickly. So it's a little bit sad to me because I think, you know, a lot of the stuff I see on Twitter now is just engagement bait, and it's not as interesting to me as it used to be. But the algorithm kind of like, I can't really blame any one person. I just think, you know, the algorithm is so dominant that it selects for that. And, you know, it kind of draws that out of people. I tend to think that this is how technology has a mind of its own, you know, instead of saying that X person invented the tweet storm, it's almost as if the algorithm sucked tweet storms out of people. Right. Because the reward mechanism was so strong, it was always going to happen. So that's one of the problems with engagement, is that engagement is kind of value neutral. It's just looking at like, hey, are a lot of people engaged with this post? And because it's kind of a broad selection criteria, there's going to be a lot of disagreement among people about what deserves engagement. You layer on that, like I'm speaking now of Twitter specifically, you layer on that sort of like political polarization and a bunch of design choices that Twitter made to sort of like throw people who don't even follow each other into each other's path. And you are always going to end up with kind of this highly polarized battleground that it's become. And, you know, this is one of the reasons probably why it was so challenging after Elon took over, because he is, you know, so politically charged himself as an individual. And he has so much distribution power and status already within Twitter. And, you know, you pair that with his nature to be kind of just to jump in and like he's kind of a troll by nature, I think. And so his willingness to just jump in was always going to sort of just like cause so much turbulence within that specific environment. But that's kind of the nature of where it settled.
Yeah. Do you think that the turbulence could kind of change? Like, do you think we could find a new equilibrium of a type of tweet that performs really well? Or is it pretty much just like temporary noise? And then Twitter's going to feel the same, you know, in a little while as it always has. Because I kind of feel like it goes through these cycles where somebody discovers a format that works and they do it for a while, and then we get bored of it. And then it takes a while for like everyone to get bored of it. But like, you don't really see like the BuzzFeed tasty style video that's like over the top, you know, cooking video that kind of sped up. For a little while, that absolutely killed. And they milked it for all it was worth, but you know, it's got a half-life to it that's probably about 6 months long, or to 12 months, something like that. You know, Threads, the sort of classic like thread boy thread, seems to have had a longer half-life than like 6 to 12 months, but I feel like it's on the decline now, you know, like and I'm curious if you kind of feel like it's fashion where it's always changing, or if you feel like it'll be more like someone just has a slight tweak on the thread boy thread to unlock the new, you know, S curve of their own follower growth or whatever. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, part of it depends on how they tune the algorithm. I feel like, I don't know for sure, but I feel like Twitter tried to copy TikTok a little bit, at least algorithmically. And I feel like it's worse in my experience because I follow a lot of people, but I don't actually see their tweets anymore. And I think part of it is because a lot of the people I follow don't try to post really like engagement-based style stuff. But that becomes self-reinforcing because then I don't see that stuff and I can't star it. And for a while I was like, oh, I wonder if just those people left Twitter. And then I would go to their profiles and I would see that they had been tweeting. I was just like, oh, it's weird that I don't see any of their stuff anymore. And I think that's one of the problems of selecting so hard for engagement, is that everybody then reflexively learns to post that type of stuff. And the people who lean into that win the game. You know, this is all just ultimately is structured like a game, because the algorithm does choose what gets distribution and what doesn't. That is just a game. That's like a game with certain rules that we kind of learn. And it's interesting. This is not just Twitter, but YouTube, Instagram. If you talk to prominent creators who post a lot of content, it's odd how they just get like a sixth sense intuition for when something has changed in the algorithm. Like you talk to YouTubers and they're like, whoa, something changed because I've posted 100 videos just like this, and suddenly this one got no distribution. What happened? And then you see how quickly they adapt. You know, when YouTube was like, we're going to prioritize longer videos, suddenly like all the videos people were making were like an hour long with like 15-minute introductions and everything, because everybody was padding. And, you know, it's like any algorithm, the PageRank algorithm, like why are recipes always at the bottom of super long pages? You know, everybody's just reacting because everybody wants distribution. So it's tricky if you are the person in charge of an algorithm at one of these large scale networks. There's just so much power that you have. And I don't know. On the one hand, I think Twitter, you know, people keep predicting its demise. And one reason I think there hasn't been something to replace it is it's not actually that great a business. And so there aren't a lot of entrepreneurs who really want to chase the Twitter business. I mean, even like Elon keeps complaining about how they're going to be bankrupt and they're just like burning money. And you're like, text is just kind of like a niche network for, you know, public intellectuals and certain people who select for text. So I don't think that many entrepreneurs are chasing that space. But secondly, a lot of things that try to replace Twitter try to fix some of its issues by essentially really slowing down distribution. And honestly, I think a lot of people who stay on Twitter are in there for the drama, the sort of collective space where you can kind of gawk at people, you know, that are making fools of themselves or that you disagree with. Like that's actually like a part of, I think, the pleasure of it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to quantify this. I just know that that seems to be a big part of what's there. And so when people are like, okay, we want to remove that, then maybe they're building something different at that point, which is great. But I think that people who will be selected for staying on Twitter are there for that. You know, in large scale human communities, gossip has proven to be a very efficient mechanism for groups of people to communicate their values and to kind of govern each other's behavior. So this is, you know, what's odd is that Twitter feels a bit like this giant pseudo public gossip channel. And part of this is the choice of Twitter to say, you know, it's crazy what percentage of tweets I see in my timeline that are not from people I follow. They could have just made the choice to not show me those. It's like, I didn't follow those people. I don't want to see it. But they have just kept leaning into increasing distribution for highly engaging tweets. So people I disagree with, I still see their stuff a lot in my feed. You know, people I follow, if they like something from somebody I don't follow, it'll still show up in my feed. And that decision is good, I think, for engagement, especially in a kind of like a politically charged environment. But it means that it's hard for them to kind of escape that local maximum of high drama.
Yeah, I definitely think drama never goes out of fashion, you know. Like even if a certain format of thread that's like kind of lightly edited Wikipedia article style thread gets old or but you know, people will always, as a new parent, Twitter really made sure that I saw the tweet from the dude talking about how he wanted to get high on a Saturday with his friends rather than be with his child. And so there's always going to be things that,
there's something very cathartic. You know, it's even like, why do people gossip and you know, shame people whose behavior seems sort of like outside the norms. There's something just cathartic about like unloading to somebody about like, oh, my like, you come home and you tell your spouse about your crazy coworker who, is doing something, or, and Twitter just kind of provides that, but just on like a much larger scale.
Yeah. Crazier. It's like hyper palatable craziness.
I always like to say that it's funny that there was a period, I think 2019 when I wrote this piece probably was like maybe the peak period of this, but you'd always hear Zuck and like Jack Dorsey talking about, Twitter and Facebook as the new public square. It was their favorite metaphor. Like I saw it in so many articles. And someone gave me this book on public squares. I forget the name of it now, but what's funny is they kind of serve two of the purposes of public squares, but I don't think it was kind of like the civic minded version of the public square that they intended. So two big functions of public squares in the past were for distribution of propaganda from like governments. And the second was for like public executions.
Right.
And Twitter feels like this, like when, like that dad that you just mentioned, or like there's always somebody that we have to mob up on. And, Canetti's book, Crowds in Power, is really funny because he talks about how, we love participating in mobs because it's the one time we can release the burden of maintaining our individuality. It's very stressful to maintain like your individual persona all the time. People use the term personal brand now, but across all these social networks, you're trying to maintain some image of yourself. But when you can just mob up on somebody and cancel them, it's like being in the mosh pit at a concert. There's no pressure. Like you're just one of this crowd, and how it's very pleasurable to actually be free of that burden. And I think there's something true about that with Twitter. It serves as that space for that. But I don't know that it's healthy. This ultimately, if we were to talk about status at a high level and come back to it, I do think one of the challenges of status and status seeking is that it makes many people miserable because it's never ending, and social media increases the geographic space of status competition. So I think that's a challenging thing for people who are growing up in this era.
I feel like one way out potentially is as an individual to focus less on the output, which is status, which is out of your control, and focus more on the input, which is like doing things that are useful or entertaining or informative. Something I wrote about a little bit in my post. I'm curious what you think about that, because like the sort of evolutionary origins of status, as written about by people like Joe Heinrich, is you want to be close to people who can do useful things, because they might do that useful thing on your behalf or for you, or because you could learn how they do it, right? And so that there's prestige status, which is kind of like same thing, and that's as opposed to like dominant status, which is I can hurt you, right? And so I'm curious, like if it feels like a sort of healthier place for me as a writer to be of like what would be useful, right? Or like just what do I want to know, and then I can actually learn it by going to the trouble of figuring it out and writing about it. Versus like what are people going to think, kind of, or how is this going to help my numbers or something like that? At some level, if it's a business, you have to care about the numbers, but for personal fun purposes.
Well, again, this goes back to the feed as kind of like the primary arena for Twitter. It's just very hard when the feed acts as the public scoreboard and you don't even know if you're like it's probabilistic distribution that we've moved into. I don't know if people remember early Twitter. I was on in like 2007. It was like early, and it was super boring, and it was entirely deterministic. Like you only saw in reverse chrono order tweets from people you followed, and they were super boring. Like my first two tweets were a year apart, and they were both about doing my taxes. And people would be like, I'm eating a sandwich now or something. And you're like, gosh, this network's never going to go anywhere because it's just so boring. Like nobody cares about any of this. And then it flipped at some point. Third-party services built these scoreboards for super viral tweets. And I remember going to look at them. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. People are posting really funny jokes. And then the reflexive nature of social media is that you kind of learn from other people. And and you do that. And I think they kind of leaned into it because, if you're trying to grow a network and your metrics are all built around engagement, and then you use machine learning algorithms, it can kind of just take on a mind of its own and just run away from you. And it is true, I think, that, selecting for certain things, maybe like what you were talking about with writing, maybe you want to select for high quality writing. How do you do that? How do you get that input? It's harder to select for those types of criteria. And so when you're trying to govern a network at scale, you tend to take the easier inputs. Likes and these lightweight feedback mechanisms are just much easier to capture. And so they tend to be overweighted in systems like this. But, you were talking about email earlier and Substack, and I think of, group chats as kind of a thing that I've seen a lot of people move towards and away from social media, because it's deterministic. Like, I know these people are going to get exactly what I post, but also there's nobody else looking. So I don't have to worry about I'm just like communicating with the people in the group chat. The feed, because it became so public and promiscuous, everybody knows that everybody's watching, or that that, like, if you post something, you have to perform for an unknown audience, because who knows who the algorithm is going to show it to, but you have to assume that it might be seen by anyone on Earth or anyone on that service. That leads to something it's not exactly like a panopticon in the strict definition, but it's kind of like a collective panopticon. It's some weird networked panopticon. And that's why we invented the term social media. Like, I don't know when that term was first used, but I don't remember using it in the very early days of the internet. Like, it was all like social networking or whatever. But the part where we decided to do this mass distribution feed, it did become media. Like, we all became media creators. We were broadcasting to an audience that might, you could write a tweet or post, something and have it picked by the algorithm and distributed to a huge audience. And, we never had that before. Someone writing some random post or posting some random TikTok today on an absolute basis can reach more people than, like Caesar back in the peak of the height of Rome. That's a weird thing to change, from a configuration standpoint for how information moves through the world. And honestly, we probably weren't, like, most people weren't ready for that. There's a reason that when you get a huge pulpit, you end up having to go through PR training or all sorts of things, because most people aren't ready for the consequences of that. Like, depending on what happens to Snapchat, even if Snapchat went away, I do think one thing that, like, will be part of their legacy is causing many of us to rethink, well, does everything have to be remembered forever? Like, maybe the default configuration of networks should be that things expire sooner. And that part of what always defined human life, or what it meant to be human in the past, was that we would forget things, and then things generally are forgotten. And we just flipped the bit on that overnight. And, you see a lot of people who probably regret that and weren't ready for that. So again, all this stuff, I think, comes down to architecture and design of these things. And I think now that we're more aware of these dynamics, as people build the next generation of networks, hopefully they can be more thoughtful about those mechanics and why, you would choose one thing over the other.
Do you think there will be a next generation of networks, or are we just kind of like stuck with what we got?
I think there will be. I think the challenge has been that, from a monetization standpoint, we have this like giant ad duopoly, and traditionally with social networks, there's such an advantage to being free, and so it's hard right now because you're competing basically with the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, in that. But I do think they're both challenged by, I think our existing social networks are challenged by some decisions they've made that seem to be one-way decisions that will be very hard for them to reverse. And I think the other thing is that social networks, new ones, tend to grow among the youth because they're forming new social networks as they move out into the world. And so they'll be less beholden to, they're less sort of like invested in older social networks. I mean, just the fact that so many people left Facebook is evidence that, you know, one of the largest social networks in the world couldn't hang on to some amount of people. And there is, you know, like in a classic disruption sense, I think there are some things, you know, like I think people have always admired Facebook and Zuck for being able to make drastic shifts, drastic pivots. But there are some things that are like a step too far, even for networks like that. I mean, they are mostly monetized through advertising. And so they kind of have to hang on to engagement-based algorithms to the bitter end. I hope that and I do think you're right. Like the thing you said earlier, I do think we collectively learn as users of these things when things start making us miserable for a long time or feeling like work, we can, like I've seen a lot of my friends leave Twitter recently, and I saw friends leave Facebook in the past, and I've seen people leave Instagram. And so it's fine. I haven't actually used social media as much over the past year myself as just like kind of taking a break from it. And I miss some things about it, but it wasn't, you know, it was actually probably healthy in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would like for there to be, I just think it's fun for there to be new things and for progress to happen. It seems like a lot of the new stuff that's come out has not appealed to me personally as someone who's less visual. Like I've never been a big Instagram user or Snapchat user. I like YouTube, but that's because there's a lot of like informational content on YouTube.
Yeah.
It feels like all the things that could take the place of Twitter have not gotten so like there's just been a ton, and they all, any text-based sort of social network has really struggled. Right now is probably like the best moment for it in a really long time for Mastodon, and it doesn't really seem like they're prepared, maybe. Like I don't know. Yeah. Like if you have to choose a server, or if you want to like switch servers and you like lose all of your followers or whatever, like I think it's kind of not gonna work. So it almost in some ways feels like this moment is like squandered, and like maybe there was a moment in history where if there had been a little bit more user friendly like alternate to Twitter right now, then maybe we'd see more dynamism. But I don't know. I'm curious what you think about like kind of Twitter-esque text information thought-based social networks.
Yeah. I mean, you're right that there hasn't been one to date. And even if you take non-text-based things, like if you take things like Be Real or whatever have been like the trendy photo apps in the past, it does feel a little bit like we're running in circles because they try to recreate a lot of the same dynamics as the past. That's why I think, you know, architecturally, you have to actually just choose a different design from the start to do something different. So I think of the internet as having been divided into 3 eras, and maybe 2 that we've lived through so far. And how I define it is not sort of Web 1, Web 2. I define it as what was the dominant algorithm that directed the most human attention over those 2 eras. So in the first era of the internet, it was PageRank to me, because just like we didn't know how to find anything on the web, and we needed something to make sense of it. So PageRank became the thing that like every day a gazillion people went there to start their journey on the internet. And it chose like whatever query you said, it chose what the top result would be. And that would get like 90% of the clicks. The second era is really the social media era, where a bunch of social media feed-based algorithms drive most of what we see on a daily basis, because most people open their phone and open some social app, and then the algorithm is chosen to rank certain stories high. What's interesting about both those algorithms is that they're proxies for quality, I guess, for lack of a better term, but they both kind of use engagement as the dominant criteria. So PageRank was looking at inbound links, and eventually they adapted it. But, you know, in the beginning, it was just like, hey, how many links point to this page? It's like our proxy for quality. And then social media, of course, most of them also use engagement, just like these posts are engaging, so we're going to show them more to people. I think with the advent of AI and a better understanding of social graphs and things, maybe in the third era, of the internet, we can start selecting more directly for quality and interests, and rather than using just proxies. Engagement has been actually a pretty good selection criteria for, quality generally, but it's not perfect. We know that because a lot of engaging posts are really annoying. So I'm hopeful that that may be one of the like sort of subtle impacts of AI and things, is like, hey, can we combine our graphs with AI and start selecting specifically for the things that I personally care about? Like, that's always been a weird thing to me about Twitter, is that they mostly rely on brand advertising. And yet that's probably the network where I select the most for things that I'm kind of interested in, but doesn't seem to know what I'm interested in. And the ads are unbelievably bad. Like, I always look at my Twitter ads, like, why are you showing this to me? I don't understand. After all I've done on there, why you don't have a better sense for what I care about.
Might be supply of ads, because their advertiser base is kind of bottom of the barrel.
Yeah, it could be that. And I also just think, like, maybe because, Apple with ATT kind of kneecapping advertising for a lot of networks, maybe the next generation of entrepreneurs will be forced to do something that's not ad monetized. And that would lead to a bunch of better incentives.
Yeah.
I am saddened by the fact that when you look at the architecture of Western social media, the thing that it commoditizes the most is human attention. That's the thing that's the lowest common denominator, and it just throws our attention around willy-nilly. And, I think what we pay attention to as a society is maybe the most important thing that we have. And it's been hijacked by a bunch of things. Like, I definitely, like, pre this last year, I would like be scrolling some stuff, and I was just like, oh my God, like, I can't believe I looked at that. Like, I spent time on that. But it's almost at it's almost happening at a limbic level. Like, someone just hacked the limbic system of my brain.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think there's still hope, but I think we need to understand why the systems we have now are a little bit broken, so that we build something different the next time around.
Yeah, I would like, sort of to your point earlier about not seeing your friends' tweets, I would like friend mode Twitter, because I really, there's a lot of people that I would like to stay in touch with, and Twitter's the only way, really. I mean, not even just the best way. Like, I just don't like, we're not connected on LinkedIn. I don't ever really want to look at LinkedIn. Group chats they only work up to a certain scale, and it's hard to organize. Everything's already basically organized on Twitter. Maybe that's what someone should build, is like a I don't know, Chrome extension, or like an app that plugs into your Twitter feed and only shows you from like people you actually know or something. And you could manually construct a list, but that would be too much work. There's probably some way to do that with AI.
Well, if you think about the graph configuration as a piece of infrastructure, I think one challenge is that we have a very shallow understanding of social graphs in the West, and we encourage people to just follow and friend people willy-nilly. But actually, we all know that, like, not everyone in our social graphs is equal, but we kind of just use the algorithm to approximate things, and it does a bad job. Like, some people I know casually, some people I trust a lot, some people are really close to me, some people I don't know, but I admire their thoughts on XYZ. We all intuitively, personally have that understanding. If our social networks had an understanding of that, they could select better for what content to show us from what people, and not just use engagement as the proxy for that. And that's just such a lossy way of approximating that generally. But yeah, our graphs today are really, really flat and they're not data rich. Like, they don't even really have a great proxy for trust outside of that. It's just like, oh, you have 1,000 friends on Facebook, we'll just let the algorithm sort of like manage between all the stuff they're posting. And that's why it failed in some way. And it's the same for Twitter, which is too bad, because that's a network that could use that the most.
Yeah, I think it's a real problem. Like, what you were describing with the sort of engagement based stuff, that you can see why people like it, but it's not something that you feel like you need in your life or helps anyway. Like for me, the dad who wanted to get high on a Saturday or whatever. It's like, I came to Twitter that day, not really to see that. And then, I can have a joke about it with like my wife, but it would be great if there was a better way to kind of stay in touch with people that I actually, care about. Not even necessarily that I know personally. Like, I don't want the sort of like Facebook version of this. I want it to be like internet friends or whatever, but yeah, it's hard to, maybe it's sort of a pipe dream. Maybe it's just like a status thing unto itself to complain about stuff like that when deep down I really like it. Cause obviously I sent it to my wife and I still remember it and talk about it in this session. So, you know, maybe I don't know what I really want.
Maybe we could look at some questions from folks or take some, since I haven't been tracking it well, but I'm just scrolling through that. Are there specific things there, Nate, that you want to?
Yeah, there's been a great like kind of running commentary, but I guess, I don't know if anybody wants to, Anna, how do you recommend we usually do these?
I've also read a bunch of and added a bunch of questions, really good points. I would just use the hand raise feature if you go to reactions, just so that you give Nathan a chance to like select you in order of appearance. That would be super helpful.
All right, Kieran.
Hey, thanks so much. Really love the chat. Really nice to meet you, Eugene. Huge fan of your work. One thing I've been wondering as we're getting going here is very curious why you think a location or map-based social network hasn't really gained widespread adoption. So obviously there was like Foursquare and Zenly and now SnapMap, but I really think there's a lot of power to location. Is it maybe the virality effects aren't as strong, but would really like to just hear your opinions on that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been top of mind for me because I've always kind of wanted a better map-based social network. One of the challenges, I mean, like obviously initially with Foursquare was just like not enough density to achieve kind of critical mass of liftoff. But I do think now, like if you were better able to map trust between people, if you had a higher resolution graph, then maybe location sharing wouldn't have to be so high friction. One of the challenges right now, if I know a lot of people actually do use, like I know people who use map-based things like Zenly before Snapchat shut it down, or Snap Maps, or even iPhones Find My Friends. And different people have used success. But it has, something like iPhones Find My Friends. It's great if everybody participates in your friend group, but it's just like so high friction to get everybody to do it. So I think lowering the friction of that, if you could map trust, you could say, look, these people I trust, they can have my location when I want to appear on the map because, it's like somebody I trust. So I want that to be on and not have to just like keep turning it on one at a time. I think would work. Like, I think one of the benefits of building on social in this day and age is that just many more people have smartphones that have, a GPS in it. And, back in the early days of social, it was just harder to build. And so I think the next wave of social, one reason I'm optimistic is that they don't have to start from like bare bones, nothing. So yeah, I'm still hopeful for that. In many ways, you think about geography, like let's take not a literal map, but let's just say map of where you are on the internet. Like, are you findable? In fact, if we include video games in that and Discord, you would say, oh, okay, we actually do have a lot of sort of this like ability to find other people we care about somewhere, whether it's in the physical world or in a digital world, in a game. And so we actually do have quite a number of successes on that front. So yeah, I'm hopeful. I think that is a promising vector.
Love it. I think Anna, raise your hand next.
Yeah, thanks. I have a comment to Kieran's point and that now to Eugene's point as well. A couple of thoughts here. It's so interesting that whenever we talk about Twitter, somehow the map and the territory idea comes up. And if you've ever gone viral on Twitter, there's this really weird sensation when you kind of visualize the entirety of the globe. because first you go viral in California, and then Asia wakes up, and then India wakes up, and then Russia likes your tweet, and then Europe. Like, it's the whole thing is so spatial. And I mentioned Sam Altman in the chat, kind of as he's now jokingly quoted saying in 2019 that OpenAI's AI will figure out how to monetize itself, or what parts of it are monetizable. And everybody was kind of laughing at him. And now here we go. But the other thing that always comes to mind is how Sam Altman was talking about how his first startup, which he sold, which was a location-based app, Looped, back in the early golden days, didn't work. And when they asked him, like, okay, so you are this big fortune teller, why didn't your first company work out? And he says that it's because it was locations-based, and that he overestimated as a young student on campus the importance of location. In Interintellect, we have a gazillion location channels on our Discord, but people come to online salons and want to meet each other from all over the world. And then they seek out people that they found out at the online salons that, oh, they happen to be in the same city, or they happen to live in the same city, and then they want to meet. So there's this kind of inhale, exhale in how location matters. And I think, building fully on it is an overkill. I've also heard Jack Dorsey speak live about how the entirety of Twitter goes back to his fascination in his childhood with maps. So he was obsessed with maps as a boy. And then as a programmer, he became obsessed with dispatch systems, which is basically an information map of the physical map. And the first incarnation of Twitter, which was boring and people were sharing, sandwich news on it, was based on the dispatch system. Which to me is fascinating. And you kind of see how the map is the territory. And when you go viral, it turns back into the map, because there is space-time and there are time zones, and not everybody is awake all at the same time. Although maybe during COVID, yes, but that's because we were up all the time. So to me, these mappy notes do seem to be more important than they look, but not probably in the literal sense. And I would put a lot of money on how the next social network will put another metaphorical twist on what map is. And maybe it will come from gaming. I'm sure if Emmet was here from Twitch, he would have a lot of notes on the importance of location on Twitch.
Like one of the social networks that I feel like everyone just has positive things to say about was AIM. Back in the day, AIM was like, it was kind of geography. It was just online or offline, like binary, and the status messages. And it was like only people that you had that you could see if they were online or off. So it was like deterministic network paired with knowing when someone was in the online world with you. So geographically, it was binary also. It's just like, are they online or offline? But that was to me like a map paired with a self-selected social graph. And so Discord is kind of the closest thing to that, but it's mostly still used for are you on this game or not? But I think if you have two maps that you combine, one the physical world, but one the online world, then you have just like a much higher density and a chance of building something successful. If you just have the offline world, it can be tough because of the density problem.
Yeah, when Interintellect hosts ask me, what time they should put their salons to, I always ask them, who would you want to be asleep? Is it LA you don't care about? Is it Athens? It's a sphere. Unless you're on Rick and Morty, you can't have sunshine everywhere all the time. So somebody will be asleep, or you will get a bunch of people in their pajamas, which I'm sure a lot of people who are not using their videos are somewhere in the bathtub or in bed. Yeah. It's just a last note, and then I will stop grabbing on the mic. I'm Eastern European, and Europe's history throughout the 20th century is filled with war and revolutions. And when I was a kid, I was a big history buff, and I remember asking my dad, why didn't America have a revolution in the 20th century? I mean, you had a sequence of unrest, but there was never a big revolution. And my dad said, oh, it's because America is really big. You don't like it somewhere, or they don't like you, you can literally pack up and move to another state where the climate is different, the culture is different, in some cases the language is different, and like 30 years ago, you could literally disappear and you could move to a new town and nobody knew anything about you. You could start again. And that's incredibly powerful. That doesn't exist anywhere in Europe. And I remember watching, the events in the Capitol and a couple of other recent dramatic events and thinking, oh my God, America has shrunk. Social media did something to your actual map, the physical map, that I think is under-discussed and completely unforeseen. You can't really move anywhere in America anymore if you don't like it, because you're on the internet. And I think there's something there. Maybe it's for another salon that both troubles me and fascinates me.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Kevin?
Yeah. Hey, Eugene, thanks for doing this talk.
Yeah, no problem.
You prefaced a couple sentences of yours with like, this is happening on like Western media. So I'd love to like hear sort of what the alternate is with maybe like alternate architecture. You mentioned like mobile was big for Western, different. You mentioned that human attention was sort of like the main thing for like Western media. What's like the alternate there? And then you also said it for Western has like shallow social graphs. So what's the difference there also?
Yeah. I'm not sure I've come across like any large scale network where I feel like the network depth is that much better. So that might not be unique to Western. Like even if you look at WeChat as it's scaled up, one of the challenges they ran into is just, so the difference in China is, if you meet somebody and you don't add them to your WeChat, you can't go on the internet and search and track them down easily. You might just never be able to contact them again. So everybody, the custom, you meet anybody, you immediately sort of like trade WeChat credentials. So, on WeChat, my friends have like thousands and thousands of contacts. And, at some point, many people started hitting the limit was like 5,000 people. So people were creating like 2 or 3 WeChat accounts just to add all their contacts. But even there, the lack of differentiation became tricky. And, WeChat had to launch things where you could separate out business accounts from personal accounts and things like that. So I just think in general, we should try to build higher fidelity graphs in the future. Like, there are some things like Instagram has close friends or things like that, but that's still sort of like pretty rudimentary. I do think that China is the one that I know the best because pre-pandemic, I used to go back every year and, go give talks or meet with different companies. And I think obviously China is a unique environment for tech and media generally, because first of all, because of the government censorship, I think, a lot of stuff that flies on Twitter or something like that just wouldn't get any distribution or just get like shut down on networks like that. The second is, if you look at WeChat, it began as like a messaging app first, and they didn't have a feed at all. There was no feed for a long time. I don't know what year they launched Moments, which is their version of like the Facebook news feed, but it was much later. And they still, I think, have like, I don't use my Moments feed that much, but it still seems like they have a very explicit rule on there. Just if you don't follow somebody and like you're not mutual contacts in WeChat, you don't see them at all in Moments. Like you don't see their comments, you don't see their posts. It's very locked down. If you look at Western social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they went the other way. They're super promiscuous. Like, now on Instagram, more than half the stuff in my Instagram feed is from people I don't follow. Facebook has that, like I would see my friends post on Facebook and then I would see a comment from someone and I don't know who that person is, but, I would still be able to see it. And Twitter, we already talked about, they leaned into that really hard as well. They keep just like showing me more and more tweets from people I don't follow. So I don't know, that's like an explicit direction that I think maybe some networks should consider reversing. Because I always have this like 2x2 I use to break down social media. So the x-axis goes from people you know to people you don't know. And the y-axis from sort of like converged worldviews to divergent worldviews. And it's underrated, I think, how much Western social media leaned into increasing the surface area of interaction between people who don't know each other and disagree. And I think that's just an impossible space to mediate, given the very sort of crude interfaces we have now. And you see that with politics Twitter a lot. Politics Twitter drives me crazy, but Twitter kind of made it happen by trying to put those people together all the time. I'm like, these people don't follow each other. They don't agree with each other. They're not going to solve it here in this space. But it is engaging, so you can see why they made that choice. So I don't know, at a simple level, I think that's part of it. Would China social media have a lot of politics if it was allowed? Probably. The fact that they censor it gives you at least just a taste of what a less politically charged social space looks like. And in some ways it's healthier. I don't think in the West, we don't have to go down that route of censoring at top down, but we could, from an architectural perspective, choose to try to minimize that. It was a little depressing. Do you remember the change my view subreddit, or the change of view? And then they spun out of Reddit and they tried to start their own site, and they were like, hey, we want to have healthy public discourse, about really charged topics like abortion or whatever. And they had all these rules, civility, all this moderation. And ultimately they closed down because they couldn't make the business model work. So it was a little depressing that you're like, this is what it takes to have healthy public discourse and disagreement. It's just it takes a lot of work. It's not easy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Vishnu.
Hey, Gene, thanks for the chat.
Yeah.
Much appreciated. I had a question about what your thoughts are on the algorithms in dating apps, because I feel like there's a lot of dynamics that are similar to social media and dating apps, and in a lot of ways, the dating app situation is unhealthy, and different in a lot of different ways. So.
Yeah, I always people who have spent any time with me know I love talking about this topic, because I always laugh because Zuck and Dorsey, all these people kept getting called to Congress to testify, and people were and I was like, why don't we call the dating app CEOs to testify about their algorithms? You might argue that the people who design those algorithms actually impact society even more in the long run. And it's kind of a black box. And I don't know, I have a lot of friends who work at different dating app companies. And I occasionally, I've gone and given talks at different dating app places. And the more I learned about it, the more I thought, oh man, we need to shine a bigger light on this. Not necessarily because I think, look, you could say the algorithms are fair or not fair or whatever, but they really select very strongly for a very particular type of interaction. And the same thing I say about social media applies to dating apps. Social media has kind of become the dominant way that we regard each other as citizens. It's about how we see our fellow person. So Anna was talking before about the map and the collapsing of the map. In many ways, social media is the map. And that's the dominant way we actually interact with other people who live in our country. And the problem is that because those algorithms select for a very particular view, I think it drives a very high polarized view of our fellow citizen. I certainly didn't, when I was growing up and I only had the one local newspaper or the three vanilla news channels, I didn't have as dark a view of some of my fellow people as I do today. I'm like, oh my gosh, some people out there are crazy. Some of their views are just absolutely bonkers. And I don't even have an intuitive sense for how many of those people there are, but it feels like they're very prominent. And that really has shifted my view of America. If you look at dating apps, at a very base level, they're shaping the view of your own desirability, your value as a mate in society. And I think it's under discussed. And, just I could go on this topic for a whole salon, for hours, but I will just say that it has created a crazy power law in the dating world that like, I think if we made it more public how these algorithms work, at least we could have a discussion of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and whether that's the way we want to do matching. Something like, I don't know, in America, I think among like younger people, something like 1 in 2 marriages is through a dating app now, and it just keeps going up. So we've basically handed over kind of like the dominant mating algorithm to a bunch of companies, and they're like running random tests and making a bunch of random decisions. And I think this is, but this is also the challenge of machine learning algorithms generally, is that there's an inherent level of black box to them all, because the interaction effects of millions of people using these at scale we'll never get like the satisfying answer. It's the same thing that I think the same challenge we're going to run into with AI, of that we desire a certain level of explanation and clarity that we may never be able to get when we hand over more and more of everything to algorithms. Like if you were like, hey, why did I don't know, why did I get shown this story, or why did I get shown this person in a dating app? There isn't an easy way to reverse engineer and like show you like just some formulas like, oh, this is exactly why it happened. It's too complicated. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we just have to be comfortable with that level of uncertainty. This is why I always feel like algorithms are kind of like new gods in this world. It's just like a little bit incomprehensible beyond our understanding. And that's, I don't know, it's part of the frustration.
Connor?
Hey, great talk so far. So I've been kind of thinking about the different kind of powers that are kind of pushing on each other with the design of social media. And you kind of have some like bundling forces and unbundling forces. Mm-hmm. So, the kind of the bundling forces are Metcalfe's law and, the ability to talk to anyone else on the planet instantly. Mm-hmm. But then kind of the unbundling forces are generic content, the not spam, but the signal to noise problem that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just kind of like wondering, is there a world where we start to unbundle from a while? We go from cable to Netflix and Hulu and move to more like smaller, cozier social medias that maybe have a little bit more utility baked in. So like, some examples of this might be like Letterboxd, Strava, Be Real, even like things that are just like not everyone in the world is on these things. They serve like more like niche communities. Or do you think that like Metcalfe's law is just too powerful, and that in the West we're just too addicted to talk to everyone? So like, is it possible we move toward like the smaller decentralized federated culture? Is that something that's possible, or do you think that the other effects are too strong?
Yeah, I think it is possible. I mean, maybe these like global social media based style apps will never go away fully, but I've already seen in my personal life and among friends of mine a bigger shift to group chats as the dominant social media interaction space. And if you think about those are kind of like small, federated, deterministically distributed spaces. And they're great. The problem, of course, with those types of things is that they don't monetize that well. They've never been great businesses, but they're great services. And so I think the question is, can we be creative and move to some new equilibrium of monetization so that, if they could be better businesses, maybe you would see more sort of like entrepreneurial attention dedicated to continuing to innovate on them and build on top of them. I'm hopeful. Like, I think it's hard to shift off of advertising as just like such an efficient equilibrium. Like you see with Snapchat now, when ATT from Apple shipped and they got kneecapped on the revenue side, they shipped Snapchat Plus, but it's like, it's a drop in the ocean compared to their previous advertising revenue. It's not an easy move to make. But maybe if you were building a social network from scratch today, and you were like, look, there's just not going to be advertising. We don't have the scale and we're never going to build around that. Then maybe you could be healthier from the beginning. And maybe the model will have to be things like games and other things where they've solved, if you look at free to play games and you look at what young people are willing to pay for cosmetic enhancements in games, I think there's something directional there is interesting to a future that is more utilitarian. I will say that the other thing that the West suffers from right now, and like more and more people are talking about it, is that we kind of have a dominant duopoly in mobile operating systems, which makes some of the stuff that China has not possible. Like, in a strange way, I'm in no way advocating for Chinese style, like top-down regulation and censorship on the Western internet. But in some ways, the CCP regulated WeChat in a way that has made some of the behavior, like monopolistic behavior, less possible for them. And, if you were to do WeChat style utility in the West, one of the challenges is that you couldn't do payments right now because you'd be giving up 30% to iOS and Android. And that's just not financially tenable. But, when I used to come back from China, I'd always had this weird sense of, going from the future and then arriving back in the US and going into the past of the internet. I'm like, wow, our internet is like way less functional. It's way more busted. You can't do a whole bunch of things that connect the online and offline worlds in a really great way. And so I don't know. I'm hopeful that maybe we need some sort of regulation of mobile operating systems in the West to unlock mobile like fully, like to truly make it so that we can have deeper utility. That's why, it was funny that Elon was, like, I think he was getting there because he was talking about building a super app. I forgot what he called it, and then he started complaining about the iOS monopoly a little bit. And then now he seems to have backed off of that. But at least that was directionally, something that I think everybody in tech realizes. Yeah. So we'll see.
I definitely think 30% is inevitably going to get, something will happen, I think.
Yeah.
It just doesn't, there's too much of the world's communication and value flows through Apple devices for it to, it'd be like if Google tried to institute that on Chrome, it doesn't work. It breaks too many things in society for there to be a 30% take rate,
Yeah. It's funny because remember Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt had the falling out when Google shipped Android.
Yeah.
But I always say that, that was the greatest gift they could have given to Apple, because every time someone is like, hey, we got to regulate iOS, Apple's like, well, look, Android has more market share than we do. So how could you regulate us? All tech companies should all non-Apple tech companies need to band together, put together a whole bunch of cash, give it to Google to cancel Android. Then iOS will get regulated immediately, and then we would all benefit.
That's it. We should start a Kickstarter. I like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe the last one, Anna.
I would like to go back to the dating app question, because I think it's very important. But if that's derailing the conversation anyway, I'm also happy to, or just be very brief. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'm so happy that we have so much to talk about, that we're not talking about what Elon did on Saturday. This is it speaks to the sophistication of our community and our hosts, and we're talking about more, things of probably like longer term effect. So that's great. It's really interesting, again, to kind of come back to the map question, because when we talk about how certain types of social media entrench polarization, for instance, in the US, it is today determining where people move. The political diversity of different smaller environments, areas within cities, suburbs, and then states and kind of time zones, all of that seems to be changing, and people move with bigger enthusiasm to be around people with the same politics. And if you think about that, then there's also the other effect of actual DNA that people have started marrying exclusively people from their own political persuasion, which seems to be unprecedented. And, you know, of course, when we talk about dating apps, and by the way, I would love a follow-up salon just about dating apps, because there's so much research and so much to discuss, and talk about status as a service, like literally. Like that's what is more related to your status than, you know, who you end up living your life with. It started well before apps. There's this motto flying around in social sciences that Match.com killed American religiosity, because people used to go to church to meet their significant others, and then they started going on Match.com, and the percentages dropped, which I find fascinating. But also that just in Interinteract, we have 5 very serious couples. Some of them are already married amongst our hosts and community members, and they have moved across geographies to be with each other. I think actually all of them moved at least within the US or England to move in with the other person that they met in Interinteract. And so what else is shifting the map more than actually making people meet on the internet who feel like living their lives together? So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, it's very true. And it's the same for political polarization. You know, that started in the US before social media. Just as you said, you know, assortative mating started increasing in the US before dating apps came along. But it's also true, I think, that both of those things, social media and dating apps, amplified and accelerated those phenomenon because of very particular design choices they made. And the question is like whether we are comfortable with that collectively as a society. And I generally look, I'm generally, when I hear about government regulation of tech, like a lot of it doesn't seem very well thought out, and I question a lot of it. But that doesn't mean that I don't think we shouldn't, as people, be able to collectively, you know, question if we have to live with, you know, the design choices of a bunch of random people at these app companies, and that we shouldn't have more transparency so we can just talk about it as like, hey, do we want dating app algorithms to work exactly this way? For example, on the assortative mating thing, I happen to know like at least one of the big dating apps that people use today does tiering of people based on what school they went to as an undergrad. And they feed that tiering into their algorithm of who they show you, because they're like, look, while assortative mating is on the rise in the US, so why don't we just give people more of that? So like if you went to a Harvard, then you'll match with more, you know, Harvard people. And if you went to like some state school, you won't see the same Ivies. And like, that's like a pretty big choice to make without people knowing about it. Like, do we want that? Like, is that the right way? Like, how do people feel about that? I think because it's all this like big black box, we don't realize how quickly the whole dating app thing has moved in crazy directions. I think people just like aren't dating apps, and they just like have like you just judge intuitively. You're like, oh, these are the type of people I'm matching with. I guess that's like who I'm supposed to be with.
I think that's everybody.
No.
Like in Europe, you're like, oh my God, everybody in this city has a postgraduate degree. No, that's all you see. It's not that suddenly everybody has a.
Right. And that's the problem when that becomes your reality. You know, someone else chose the geography that you're going to play in. And look, I mean, there's always been geographical limitations to dating, even before dating apps. And, you know, some people argue it was even more restrictive. But that, I think the logical fallacy is just like, yeah, that's true, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a say in how it works moving forward. Like, it doesn't have to be that way.
To me, the frontier for a lot of this stuff, dating apps, social media, everything is, it's going to be too complicated, like you were saying earlier, to explain how the algorithms work in a lot of cases. But at least I think there's a huge argument to be made for we should be able to choose algorithms and develop our own algorithms if we want to. I just feel like that makes so much sense on a lot of different levels. If you think about it like a search problem, there's a huge database of stuff. Maybe it's tweets, maybe it's people in a dating app, whatever. You need some way to filter. Time is one variable. In the case of tweets, you probably want to bias towards newer stuff, but there's so many other variables. and so many different ways to slice and dice it. We should be able to choose. We should be able to develop our own, and we should be able to use multiple for different purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right.
Cool. Well, that's a great note to end on. Eugene Wei telling me he thinks I'm right. Anybody?
Well done, Nathan.
Yeah, all right. Any closing thoughts, Eugene?
Yeah, well, I guess just one last thought to end on is that we do, like, we are sort of like part of these systems, like every little bit, like, and it's, we are like mildly complicit in all of these systems, but it also means that we have some level of, say, like we can walk away from different things. Maybe the thing that replaces these things isn't quite there for us yet to leave to, but, just like for me in the past year, I know, like, because I was thinking of like going back and doing a startup. And so I was like, well, one way to do this is maybe I'm going to stop using some of the things I use, see what I miss, and see what I want to fill that space. And this was always the thing about, like, I would run into people who I felt like were unhappy because they were constantly playing weird status games. And it felt like the internet made the status games so global that like they were impossible to win. Like the people would just never be happy. And you can like find more peace and happiness by choosing these things. Now that we're aware of them, I think, you're like, oh, my limbic system is being hacked. You can take control of that and not be attracted all the time by engagement bait. And I've tried to do that to the extent possible over the past year, and I think it's been better for me generally. So yeah, hopefully people find that for themselves.
Amazing. Love it. I think that's a great note to wrap up on. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This was a ton of fun. And I guess we'll see you on Twitter with all the other stuff that's there.
Happy holidays. Thank you for everybody
all right.
coming out.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.